In this episode, I interview Carl Benedikt Frey, author of How Progress Ends, Technology, Innovation, and the Fate of Nations. This is a great discussion, as you will see in the episode. Actually, we tackle quite a few interesting topics that span from a little bit of historical analysis going forward where we are today. We make some analogies looking at the industry and even more. The discussion is quite interesting because Carl has done an amazing research into looking possibly into potential institutional structures, the way they evolve over time to actually help out progress, technology, innovation. And, one of the most striking aspects of the book is that progress and innovation are not to be taken for granted. And as we see in the interview, and as you can see in the book if you read it, actually, they took a long time to emerge, and even to maintain, they are like super expensive in terms of like institutional structure that you got to really maintain in order to be able to keep, again, progress and innovation, make society go forward. And we cover all those aspects again in the interview. It's an in-depth discussion about history, modern times, and where we're going next. Carl, thank you for joining this conversation. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you here.
Good to be with you.
Yep, amazing. And just to get straight into the topic, but before we dive right into it, like you did write like a great book, How Progress Ends. I loved it. It's been like one of those books that you read with great pleasure because it's a great historical analysis in the first place, and then on the other side, really making sense of the patterns of history. So before we get right into the full topic, what inspired you to dive into this research? How did you come up with the thesis of the book and everything else? It would be interesting to hear from your side.
Well, thank you first for your kind words about my book. That's wonderful to hear. So I've been interested in technological change for a long time. I read Joel McCure's book, The Lever of Riches, back in school, and what that taught me is that technological progress and innovation are the key drivers of human prosperity, but there's nothing natural about technological change. There was nothing inevitable about there being industrial revolution. If progress was inevitable, it wouldn't have taken 200,000 years for humanity to have an industrial revolution. Most countries around the world would be rich and prosperous today. And if progress was inevitable, why do we see former technology leaders like Britain in decline? And so I thought it would be timely in the light of the 2 decades of productivity stagnation we've seen, not just in Europe, but actually also in the United States, to write a book pushing back against this narrative that we've inevitably going to be much more prosperous in a decade from now as a result of advances that we're now seeing in artificial intelligence, for example. And what's really puzzled me is that if you take the computer and the internet, it's hard to think of anything that should be more transformative to scientific research and innovation, because it's given much of the world our stored knowledge in their pockets. It's connected some of the best and brightest individuals around the world. It's streamlined the research process enormously. And what do we get? A decade-long productivity upsurge from roughly 95 to 2004, confined mostly to the United States. And since then, we see research productivity declining. It takes 17 times as many engineers to produce Moore's law today as it did in the 1970s. And we're seeing a similar pattern across the economy. Other measures of breakthrough innovation, like patents, show um, a similar trajectory. So I think we need to realize that just advancing artificial intelligence is not necessarily going to deliver the economic miracles that some hope for without institutional change.
Interesting. And we definitely get into the topic of AI, which it's one of the most important topics that I cover as well in on my Substack. But pretty much before we get into it, there is like a sort of decentralization, centralization pattern that you identify throughout your research, and you have like many historical cases. But how do we understand that, especially looking at where centralization helps versus when like decentralization is key, and how like an institutional system comes about that is like solid from that perspective to generate like progress in a first place? What are some historical cases that you see that you saw like throughout your research there?
The most centralized economy we've ever seen was the Soviet Union. And it did reasonably well economically for about 4 decades or so. It grew around 6% per year on average. I should say mostly by advancing heavy industry, which didn't necessarily benefit much of the population, but it managed quite successfully to take technologies invented elsewhere and scale those advances. What it didn't have was room for experimentation and exploration. So if you were an aircraft engineer in the Soviet Union, you could go to the Red Army and ask for funding. If the Red Army declined, maybe you had two or three other options. If they declined, your idea would die with you. That's quite different from, let's say, the American system, where Bessemer Venture famously declined to invest in Google back in 1999. They probably regret it today, but it also underlines that Google was not a safe bet at the time, right? Alta Vista and Yahoo were dominating search. And to
Mhm.
really know if something will catch on or not, somebody needs to take the risk to invest in it. And the virtue of a more decentralized system is that different people can take different bets and explore different technological trajectories. And the fact that Bessemer Venture didn't invest didn't mean that Google was doomed to fail because others saw the potential. And so uh, more decentralized systems tend to do better at the frontiers of technology in terms of pushing the boundaries of what's possible. But that process of discovery is quite different from then, taking those technologies and turning them into viable products and then, producing those products at sufficiently low cost for them to become accessible to the bulk of the population. That needs large scale enterprise, it needs factories, it needs significant capital investments into building distribution systems, managerial hierarchies, and so on. And so when it comes to the latter exploitation process, it's much more plannable. And in fact, if you go back to this example of the Soviet Union, because manufacturing or mass production is quite standardized, the Soviet authorities could essentially benchmark performance across factories and hold factory managers accountable that way. But that's much harder at the frontiers of technology, because when something is new, what do you benchmark against? And so the Soviet Union did reasonably well in the age of mass production until the mass production system petered out in the 1970s. And what was needed then was something new. That new thing was the computer revolution, to which Soviet contributions were essentially none. And so I think the Soviet Union, an extreme case as it is, provides a good illustrative example of the differences and the different institutional requirements needed for exploration and scaling.
Interesting. And what are the other institutional structures that you identified in the book that instead, moved on the other to the middle, to the extreme case of it? One is where you found that the institutional framework where there was a right balance between like decentralization and centralization, at least for a specific time window of history, and then the other case where indeed decentralization, too much decentralization, might have actually also created like issues in terms of like keeping up with progress as well.
So some institutions are conducive to both scaling and exploration. So if you take the United States, its constitution essentially confined it to small scale government. What it did was creating a large domestic market, because it banned internal tariffs, and so it reduced internal barriers to trade, and it underwrote a system of secure private property rights and a patent system, which paved the way for a very liquid market for technology. And I think it's important to remember that in this period, the bulk of innovation comes from independent inventors. As late as 1880, when the second industrial revolution takes off, over 90% of patents are taken out by independent inventors, and over 80% of those patents are traded in the market for technology. And large corporations at the time don't even really do internal R&D. As far as they have R&D departments, they're mostly screening the market for external technologies and innovation. The key bottleneck that the United States had by constraining state capacity was that the state could not take much of a leading role in the rollout of infrastructure the way governments did on the continent in Europe. But through the Railway Act, Abraham Lincoln provided new incentives for firms in terms of grants, in terms of land, in terms of subsidies, that effectively created public-private partnerships to enable scaling and to enable the rollout of a railroad network, which benefited both large-scale enterprise in terms of reducing transportation costs, but also aided the flow of ideas, as inventors could move around more easily and spread um, ideas. What emerged as the new challenge in the late 19th century, though, was that many of these emerging tech giants were larger than the federal government itself. And the federal government didn't have a meritocratic civil service to draw upon. It had a patronage system whereby it exchanged campaign financing and contribution for jobs. And so what the government needed to do its job and check the anti-competitive practices of these new emerging enterprises that have been largely aided by private-public partnership was a meritocratic civil service, which eventually came with the Pendleton Act. That was a result of a public backlash against the corruption that was becoming increasingly visible with scandals around credit mobilier, for instance. And then you had this meritocratic, increasingly meritocratic civil service beginning to develop new tools like antitrust with the Sherman Act to be able to check anti-competitive practices. And this was a fine balancing act because you don't want to uh, disincentivize firms to scale, because if Ford hasn't produced the Model T at scale, it wouldn't have become the people's vehicles. It wouldn't become accessible to the bulk of the population. But you want it to have the tools to track down and mitigate anti-competitive practices. And that was a very delicate equilibrium that emerged over a couple of decades. But with that, the United States essentially had many of the institutions in place that permitted scaling in the 20th century, and that gave the state the tools to check corporate power when it threatened entry and innovation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you raised quite a few critical points here. And one is, of course, that for how much innovation can be decentralized, you get to the point where it plateaus, because actually, take the case of the railway system, but also if you want of the car, of course, you can scale up to a certain extent, because then you're going to need like an infrastructure effort that sometimes requires like bureaucracy and centralization that might help, especially to plan things a little bit longer term, right? And we're seeing it right now as well with the AI industry, I guess, because again, even with the railway industry, yes, there was a lot of scale done by decentralization, entrepreneurship, and everything, but then we still got to the point, I guess, where those railways were not connecting the whole country. And same story, I guess, with the car, right? For how much you can try to scale up the car without having the highway and infrastructure that is going to actually make it into something that can be accessible to anyone. The technology itself is not going to scale with the entrepreneurship alone. And I would say definitely seem like very similar case to today with AI, where you get to the point where yes, you can scale AI, but then on the other side you got like a bottleneck on the energy side, on the infrastructure, the whole like data center infrastructure build up and everything else that is coming up at the moment, which looks almost like those times where if you want the technology to really be accessible at scale and also give it a direction, you need like some sort of central, at least help in doing that, right? What do you see is the difference, for instance, between those times and today with the AI build-up infrastructure, and especially the tools, and also how you see the US system different today than it was, if it was, any different? It would be interesting to hear your perspective there.
So a key difference is, of course, that the applications of the railroad and the applications of steam technology more broadly were fairly clear by the time the network was rolled out. So you essentially knew what you were building it for, and therefore standardization was easier. With AI, we had a paradigm of research and innovation, I would say up until around a decade ago. We then had a paradigm of scaling up existing models and technology. And I think we're now going back to a paradigm where just scaling up existing models seem to be running into diminishing return, and more research and innovation and new ideas will be needed for further progress. And that means that we don't really know how much, in terms of valuable infrastructure, we are going to be left with the data center build out that we're currently seeing. Many of the railroads that were built over a century ago are still being used. And much of the fiber that was built during the dot-com era is also being used. With data centers, the depreciation cycle is much shorter. And going forward, I think it's quite likely that we will need to go on a path of AI development that makes AI more similar to humans, at least in terms of data and compute efficiency. And so it's possible that the build out of AI infrastructure has aided this paradigm of scaling, which is now running into diminishing returns. And so AI is not a mature technology the way the railroads were. That is a key difference.
Mm-hmm.
Another difference is that in the late 19th century, the federal government created a meritocratic civil service, and it developed tools to check corporate power and the power of incumbents threatening entry. Today, we are seeing quite the opposite. We're seeing civil service being undermined. If anything, we're seeing the civil service becoming increasingly politicized. We are seeing that loyalty is beginning to matter more than competence. And we are seeing reinstitution of tariffs, but not just that, a very complicated system of exemptions on top of that, which seems to be leading a direction that you need to build personal relationships with the White House in order to be able to exempt yourself from those tariffs, for example. And so the federal government is pushing in a very different direction as well as than the direction of travel was in the late 19th century.
Yeah, so that you see like risk of institutional decay on your side, right? So that's a bit the point that you're making, and also I guess 100% when you say like AI, still like to be approved the build out that we're doing. And if we go back at the lessons of history, actually, there, what made Europe in the first place, looking at a little bit of the way progress started to develop in the Western world, what made Europe actually think for that kind of institutional process back in the 1500 that you saw in the book that really made it possible for the West to actually become, if you want, like intertwined with the progress, become like a sort of a technological society in the first place.
So, as Walter Scheidel has pointed out, after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe became more fragmented, while China was much more centralized. And there are various reasons for that. One is actually that China was more technologically advanced, but had mainly developed technologies that aided bureaucratic governments, such as soil mapping, which allowed authorities to assess how much farmers produced and then tax them accordingly. And so they had less of a need to rely on local knowledge. The Roman Empire didn't ever build anything like a centralized bureaucracy that China did. And so when it collapsed, there were no institutions left to be captured in the way that was the case in China. And fragmentation, along, I should say, with emerging European identity among elites, as John McCure has pointed out, you see that people can escape the heavy hand of the authorities more easily by migrating from one place to another. You see that competition between European powers leads in many cases to more liberalizing reforms over the fear of being overtaken. And I think that's very clear in the clampdown of the guilds in particular. And so in Britain, Parliament realizes that for Britain to be competitive in trade, it needs to mechanize because wages in Britain are higher and they need economic growth to support various military and expansionist endeavors. And so acts of parliament laid the foundations for the turnpikes, which creates a road network in Britain, which means lower transportation costs and more competition between cities, which undercut the guilds, which regulate production locally, because all of a sudden they are exposed to competition from other cities. And the guilds do what they can to restrict the adoption of new technologies that threaten their skills, such as the technologies that made the Industrial Revolution. And then there's also a concerted effort by Parliament to actually undercut the privileges of the guilds. And I think that's one of the key reasons why Britain is first to industrialize. And then you see similar reforms and the guilds being abolished in France, in Germany, and so on as well. And so those bottlenecks, if you like, to industrialization are being removed in one country after another, and this is aided by this fragmentation and competition.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And so that really, I guess we see the emergence of what we may call like a collective brain, right? So it's something that enables like this sort of fragmentation and I guess elimination of groups that could not scale after to like a certain extent, because we know that, for instance, the guilds, especially if you look at the Renaissance, Italy played like a key role in developing like very famous like artisans and everything. But there is an issue with that, which is it could scale up to a certain extent. Instead, when like a more informal market activity came up, it was through like fragmentation and really the creation of new informal institutions that enable like Europe to become what it would after like a couple of centuries, right? That was the main process behind it.
Yeah, and so another part of the story, as you point out, is the family policies of the Latin Church, as Joe Henrik and Jonathan Schultz and others have pointed out, and that means that those policies are undermining kinship essentially, because all of a sudden people need to go outside their extended family circle to find partners, and that leads to more impersonal institutions, to more migration and the proliferation of ideas. And so that collective brain, to borrow your Henrik's term, is definitely being aided by that process. And it also goes to the point uh, previously made, that among European elites, a sort of shared European identity begins to emerge, which is going to be very important later on, in particular for the scientific revolution in Europe.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, on the other side, like China went through the opposite direction, right? And what happened historically that determined the fall of China from the same historical patterns that instead brought to the rise of Europe.
So China's development up until the 20th century can be very much seen as a sort of competition between local guilds, kinship groups, and centralized government. And as a general rule, China did better when centralizing institutions dominated, because they could integrate markets, build infrastructure, and um, do things that undercut local monopolies. But they did that for the most part as long as there were external threats that needed to be deposed of. And so as China unified and external threats gradually went away, they began, rather um, than running the government apparatus through, a meritocratic civil service, and the Chinese apparatus drew in a lot of talent that would sit the civil service examination, and that used to be an escalator to social mobility in China. Government begin to essentially auction off positions in the government, which means that local groups begin to capture the government from within. It reduces the capacity of the Chinese state during the Ming and Qing dynasties. And it really makes reform in China almost impossible. And so what you are seeing in China is a central government that just about has the sort of capacity to to respond to internal rebellion and suppress innovation and scientists through the literary inquisition, for example, which made sure that there would be no scientific revolution in China, but not sufficiently strong to provide the foundations for economic growth, or indeed combat external threats, which would eventually become clear with the Opium Wars, for example.
Yeah, and what do you think was some of the reasons for China not, for instance, opening up also when Europeans powers, came, to Asia, while you have such a different case of Japan that does the opposite move when it was a really closed country for the centuries before.
So I think part of the reason is that the state didn't have the means to actually combat internal vested interest groups the way that Japan had. And so Japan has the stronger state. You see something similar happening in Germany in the in the 19th century, when Prussia, which has a much more stronger centralist state, represses the guilds, whereas the southern provinces like Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg fails to do that. So I think China lacks the capacity to actually combat vested interests domestically or take those on. And probably also is something to the notion that Chinese authorities were more conservative than their Japanese counterparts, and stuck to old ideas.
Mhm. And when you look instead of the evolution of China into modernity, especially when they needed to make a little bit of a more conscious decision on which system would work for them, looking at what was happening also during the 50s, the 60s in other countries like Japan. What do you think were the main factors that influenced China, and how the system evolved to create the China of today?
So after Mao, I think there was a sense that China needed growth, or it would continue a century of humiliation. And so the opening up that followed was not a preferred choice by any means, but there was a sense that centralization had largely failed. And I think Dong really saw this firsthand during his southern tour. And so while Beijing and parts of the north pursued more top-down industrial policy, the South was permitted to experiment more with special economic zones, and Dong saw the results of those reforms firsthand, and decided that it was the way forward. And so even Chinese technology firms that had started off in Beijing ended up moving down south to be able to tap into global value chains and benefit from foreign direct um, investment. So I think that essentially forced the opening up from within. So not like Europe forced the opening up on China in the 19th century. It was driven by more by domestic forces in the 20th century.
Yeah, amazing. And if we look at pretty much where we are today, especially looking at the AI landscape, what do you think we are in terms of institutional landscape, technological landscape, and main differences, especially between systems might be the US, might be Europe, might be China. What is that you see at the moment in terms of progress?
So what Europe, the United States, and China has in common is disappointing productivity growth, but to varying degree, right? And so the US has done a bit better than Europe in terms of productivity. It has some other problems, and life expectancy is still higher in Europe, for example. But there is a sense of stagnation. Dynamism is declining in the United States and in China as well, uh, but for somewhat different reasons. And so in China, we see a trend towards greater political centralization, and that has had a negative effect on Chinese dynamism. And so, as I mentioned earlier, unlike in the Soviet Union, where critical industries from railroads to steel were ran out of Moscow, in China, local authorities had much more freedom to make market-based reforms and to experiment as long as they didn't do any political um, uh, experiments. And that meant that you have a system where provincial governors are competing against each other for positions inside the party based on meeting growth targets. And that created quite similar incentives to a pure capitalist system, if you like. And that is the system that Branko Milanovic has called political capitalism, that is largely behind Chinese growth since the grand opening. What we're seeing now is that the objectives are shifting. So things like technological self-reliance and national security is increasingly taking precedent over economic growth. And because private companies, which have been behind uh, much of the technological upgrading and innovation in China, are not that keen on pursuing national objectives. To them, market share and profitability are still the yardsticks on which they compete. And the Chinese, the CCP, is increasingly relying on state-owned enterprises, which have made a comeback, and that is going to be a drag on productivity and innovation going forward. And it more broadly means that more politically connected actors have an increasing advantage. And so some smaller firms like DeepSeek, which tend to be the most innovative ones, they can be permitted to fly under the radar as long as they serve national objectives. But national objectives can change quite quickly in China, and if you don't have a seat at the table, you can be in trouble quite quickly as well. And so you need a seat at the table. You need to invest more in building political capital rather than investing in innovation as a consequence. In the United States, we see growing in centralization, but within the private sector, and so entry has been in steady decline in the US. It used to be the case that when there were excess profits to be made in an industry, you saw more entry, and those profits were competed down. That no longer really predicts entry in the same way, which means that it's harder for new firms to enter profitable industries. We are increasingly seeing a decline in business dynamism, even in the tech sector as well. And we're seeing increases in anti-competitive practices like killer acquisitions, whereby incumbents buy up promising startups just to shut them down. We see a revolving door between the US Patent and Trademark Office and incumbents, where patent examiners grant incumbents low quality patents and then go on to work for those companies. And more broadly, we're seeing more spending on lobbying by incumbents, and we see that being correlated with more protective regulation. And so that is the concern in the United States. In Europe, I think competition policy is still more vigorous, but Europe lacks some of the sort of prerequisites for scaling. And so in the post-war period, Europe did well in catching up to the United States in manufacturing, in large part by forging um, single market which firms could scale into. We don't have those markets in digital and services. And so the IMF estimates that, if you take all barriers to trade in Europe and you add them up, they amount to something like 110% tariff self-imposed, sort of basically Trump Liberation Day tariffs inside the European Union. And that, caps the return on innovation, which is determined by the extent of the market. And it means that Europe doesn't have large technology companies that China and the United States have, because they have large domestic markets that those companies can scale into. And then in addition to that, Europe has some significant barriers to entry, like the GDPR, which introduces new compliance costs, for example. And so it's harder to set up and innovate in Europe, and the return to innovation in digital is lower.
And if you had to give like a policy suggestion on any of those like institutional system like US, Europe, and China today, based on the risks that you see there, what would be for each of those?
So in Europe, it's quite simply reducing barriers to trade in services, and so forging a single market in services as well, and then trying to moderate some of the rules and regulations that make innovation costly for startups in particular. In the United States, I think America needs to rediscover some things it done well in the past. And so that has to do with clamping down on anti-competitive practices. Um, Unfortunately, right now, as we discussed earlier, the American state seems to become less impartial and more political than it has been in a long time. And I do think that proceduralism, which just makes it very hard to build in the United States and Europe as well, is a key constraint on economic growth. But I think the most significant change needed is to reverse the decline in dynamism that we see, and also because artificial intelligence, after all, is a promising technology, but we're not just going to we can't just sit around and hope for it to deliver productivity gains on par with, let's say, the second industrial revolution. The reason that that the second industrial revolution was so economically significant was that it created entirely new products and industries and entirely new types of tasks, right? So the automobile industry was the largest industrial undertaking the world had ever seen. It created a host of supplier industries, and it created industries producing machine tools to make the components that go into a car. It created a range of electrical industries. Essentially, every gadget you have in your kitchen is from that era. But since the 1980s, technological efforts have focused more on automation. And the problem with automation is it's a one-off. It runs into diminishing returns quite quickly, right? And so if all we've done since 1800 was automation, we would have productive agriculture and cheap textiles, but that would be about it, right? We wouldn't have vaccines, antibiotics, rockets, airplanes, cars, computers, etc. And so most growth comes from doing new and previously inconceivable things. And the thing with incumbents is that they tend to focus on doing what they are already doing at lower cost. They are more likely to invest in automation and process improvements because they have scale. Smaller firms that don't have scale, they tend to develop new products that create new kinds of industries. And so, if you want artificial intelligence to be used for creating new products and industries and to deliver sustained growth, we need to revive business dynamism to begin with.
Yep. And so the main issue that you see there is that AI at the moment is also getting framed as automation, I guess, like as augmentation, or really like as something that can create like a whole new like paradigm, right? That's a little bit the drawback that you see at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, basically every application I can think of has to do with process improvements in automation, and it's natural to some degree. People take a tool and they look at, oh, how can I, use this to, improve what I'm already doing? How can I insert it to my workflow? And I think it has to do with incentives as well in academia, for example. So here, for us, it's publish or perish, and that means that, incentivizes people to do more projects at a given time. And so when you get a productivity tool, you can either use it to do more things, drill more holes, or you can use it to dig deeper. And the more you use it to drill more holes, the more thinly your attention is spread, the less significant any one of your projects are likely to be. And we see that as well, that in publications and patents, people doing more things tend to do less significant things.
Yeah, and indeed, one of the key challenges at the moment as well is the fact that we know with AI, we can do way more in terms of like, we might see as well like a place where firms get smaller and they can still do like exponentially more with smaller teams and with fleet of agents, these in theory. But the problem at the moment is that, again, when it gets framed as automation, not augmentation, then we have an issue because we know that those tools can do like a lot of middle out activities. But, the end to end is another thing where having a human that coordinates the task and having like a domain expert that is able to really coordinate this fleet of agents is something else that really helps out reshape the whole industries. And then I guess another challenge as well is if we get into the enterprise, we know that it takes time to do like the integration of a technology. Even when we look back at the internet with a huge promise of potential productivity growth, in reality, what we saw, it was more getting into like bureaucracy. And we saw, especially in Europe, as you say, you mentioned like the case of the GDPR. This is probably one of the most important cases where we had the chance with the new technology to actually make things leaner. And instead, what we did was increase bureaucracy because of the technology, which is sort of a paradox there. So those are some of the issues that we have.
Yeah, and it's about rules and regulations as well, right? So one of the more promising, I think, applications of AI many people seem to think is in medical discovery, right? But even if AI makes it possible for more people to engage in medical discovery, you still need to go through clinical trials, which remains extraordinarily expensive, which means that you need to partner with a large pharmaceutical company to do that. And so, because we have some of these institutional bottlenecks in place, it still means that even if the tool itself is democratizing, uh, the institutional bottlenecks are not. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should get rid of abandoned clinical trials entirely, to be clear, but we do have compelling research looking at deregulation efforts in the pharma industry and showing that it does lead to more entry and innovation, and so they do come at a cost.
Yeah. And as a closing remark, if you look around today, is there any place or like any institutions or like, any geography where you can see the pattern emerging of actually a more like a decentralized system, if you wish, like Europe of like the 1500, that you say, okay, this has huge institutional potential rather than decay?
I don't know every place in the world, to be completely transparent on that, so that may will be the case. I don't have any case in point where I say, look at this country, it's doing everything right. I mean, some places have had impressive growth over recent decades. South Korea is one of those places, and I think one of the reasons that South Korea, with similar institutions to Japan, didn't experience the same stagnation is that after the Asian financial crisis, it made antitrust more vigorous and clamped down on the shareballs conglomerates and made and that aided entry and the creation of new kind of firms. Poland has been doing very well in Europe. There are some other places around the world. And, in the end of the day, many have predicted the decline of the United States. And what is proven over the past 2 centuries is that it has tremendous resilience and tremendous institutional resilience. So I certainly don't want to write the United States off. But there is no place around the world where I look and see this is definitely going to be the next Silicon Valley.
Got it. Perfect. And it was a pleasure to have you, Carl. Great conversation and amazing book. Thank you for joining us.
I much enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.